November 22nd, 1963. Same night Kennedy died in Dallas. Vincent Torino stood in J. Edgar Hoover's private office holding a manila folder that 10 men had died trying to deliver. 9 of his crew lay scattered across Washington, D.C. like broken dolls. Torino was supposed to be number 10, but Hoover didn't kill him. Instead, the FBI director opened that folder, looked at the photographs inside, and smiled. Then he offered Torino a deal that would haunt him for 30 years. What was in that folder? Why did JFK want Hoover dead so badly he'd risk everything? And why did Hoover let the last hitman walk away alive? The answers changed everything about that November night. About who really controlled America. And about why some secrets are worth more than presidents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather chair creaked beneath Torino as Hoover circled him like a vulture sizing up roadkill. The FBI director's footsteps echoed in the mahogany-paneled office, each tap of his polished Oxford shoes marking time like a death clock. Vincent's hands trembled as he watched Hoover study the photographs, grainy black-and-white images that had cost 9 good men their lives. "Fascinating," Hoover murmured, holding one photo up to the lamplight. His thick fingers traced the edges with the care of a man handling dynamite. "Do you know what you've brought me, Mr. Torino?" Vincent's mouth felt packed with sawdust. Blood from a gash above his left eye dripped onto his collar, a souvenir from the firefight at the Lincoln Memorial that had turned Sal Benedetto into hamburger meat. "I just deliver packages, Mr. Hoover. Don't matter what's inside." Hoover's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Oh, but it does matter. These photographs, they represent the end of one world and the beginning of another." He set the images down carefully, arranging them in a neat row like playing cards. "Tell me about tonight, every detail." Vincent's chest tightened. The memory was still fresh, still bleeding. "Kennedy's people gave us the contract 3 weeks ago. Said you were a threat to national security. Said the country would be safer with you gone." He touched his ribs where a federal bullet had grazed him. "Didn't mention you'd be expecting us." "I've been expecting this visit for months," Hoover said, moving to the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. Police sirens wailed in the distance, cleanup crews collecting what was left of Vincent's crew. "Your president made a grave miscalculation. He assumed I was just another bureaucrat who could be eliminated with bullets and bodies." The photographs lay between them like unexploded bombs. Vincent could see fragments, a man in a suit, a grassy knoll, shadows that looked wrong. His stomach churned. "What are those pictures?" Hoover turned from the window, his pale eyes reflecting the desk lamp's glow. "Insurance, Mr. Torino, the kind that guarantees my continued good health and your president's cooperation." He picked up the top photograph, studying it like a love letter. "These were taken 6 hours ago in Dallas, before the motorcade, during the motorcade, after the motorcade." Ice water flooded Vincent's veins. "You're saying—" "I'm saying your president sent you here to kill the wrong man." Hoover's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "He wanted me dead because I knew what was coming. But he failed to consider that knowing about an assassination and preventing it are 2 very different things." The room spun around Vincent like a carnival ride. Kennedy was dead, had been dead for hours while Vincent and his crew were bleeding out across Washington. The contract, the mission, the photographs, it was all connected by invisible threads that were choking the life out of everything he thought he understood. "Why show me this?" Vincent's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Why not just put a bullet in my head and be done with it?" Hoover moved closer, close enough that Vincent could smell his aftershave, something expensive that couldn't quite mask the scent of corruption underneath. "Because, Mr. Torino, I need a man who's already dead. Officially, you died tonight along with your crew. No fingerprints on file, no family to miss you, no connections to your former life. I got a wife, got a kid coming. Had a wife, had a future." Hoover's correction was surgical in its precision. Vincent Torino died in a federal ambush at 11:47 p.m. on November 22, 1963. But the man sitting in my office right now, he could be anyone, live anywhere, be anyone I need him to be. The photographs seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Vincent understood now why his crew had died for them, why Kennedy had risked everything to get them delivered. They weren't just pictures, they were the keys to the kingdom, proof of sins that could topple governments. "What do you want from me?" Hoover gathered the photographs into a neat stack, then slid them into a fresh manila envelope. The gesture was casual, but Vincent caught the tremor in the director's hands. Even Edgar Hoover was afraid of what those images contained. "I want you to forget tonight ever happened. Forget Vincent Torino. Forget your old life." Hoover sealed the envelope with red wax, pressing his signet ring into the soft surface. "In return, I'll give you something Kennedy never could, a future, a new identity, a new start, enough money to disappear forever. And if I say no?" Hoover's smile returned, cold as a morgue drawer. "Then you join your friends in the morgue, and these photographs find their way to every newspaper in America by morning. Either way, the truth stays buried. The only question is whether you're buried with it." The sirens were closer now, probably entering the building. Vincent looked at the sealed envelope, at Hoover's expectant face, at the blood on his own hands. 9 men dead, a president assassinated, a country built on lies, and somehow, Vincent Torino had become the guardian of the biggest lie of all. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Vincent's hand shook as he reached for the sealed envelope. The red wax was still warm from Hoover's signet ring, and when his fingers made contact, it felt like touching the devil's own seal. The weight of it, barely 2 pounds of paper and photographs, somehow felt heavier than the Tommy gun he'd carried into this nightmare. "Smart man," Hoover said, settling behind his desk like a king claiming his throne. "The documents in the safe will provide your new identity. Frank DeMarco, recently relocated from Chicago. Mechanic, widower, clean as a Sunday sermon. Widower." The word hit Vincent like a sledgehammer to the chest. "My wife will receive word that Vincent Torino died heroically in service to his country. She'll grieve, she'll move on, she'll raise that baby believing their father was a patriot instead of a criminal." Hoover's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of a man ordering coffee. "It's a kindness, really. Better than the truth." Vincent thought of Maria's laugh, the way she hummed while cooking Sunday gravy, how her hand felt small and warm in his. He thought of the baby growing inside her, the son or daughter who would never know their real father's face. The envelope seemed to pulse in his grip like a dying heartbeat. "The money, $50,000, is already deposited in an account in Hartford, Connecticut. There's a garage for sale in a town called Beacon Falls. Quiet place, good for disappearing." Hoover opened a drawer and withdrew a manila folder. "Your new life, Mr. DeMarco. Everything you need to become a ghost." The sirens had stopped outside the building. Vincent could hear boots on marble, voices echoing up the stairwell. Federal agents cleaning up the mess he and his crew had made. Soon they'd be bagging Sal's body, scraping Tony Benedetto off the Lincoln Memorial steps, telling their wives about the crazy night when the mob tried to kill J. Edgar Hoover. None of them would ever know the truth. That Vincent Torino had walked into hell and made a deal with the devil himself. "One more thing," Hoover said, leaning forward. His pale eyes reflected the desk lamp like chips of ice. "That envelope you're holding? It's not just evidence. It's a leash. My leash. If I need you, I'll call. If you run, I'll find you. If you talk..." He didn't need to finish the threat. Vincent nodded, not trusting his voice. The envelope felt like it was burning through his jacket, searing itself into his chest. He thought of the photographs inside, those terrible images that had cost a president his life and 9 wise guys their futures. Now he was their guardian, their keeper, their prisoner. "The service elevator," Hoover said, pressing a button under his desk. "My men will escort you out. By dawn, Vincent Torino will be yesterday's news, and Frank DeMarco will be starting his new life in Connecticut." Standing up felt like moving through quicksand. Every muscle in Vincent's body screamed protest, whether from the bullet graze in his ribs or the weight of what he was carrying. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket, close to his heart, where it settled like a tumor. At the door, he turned back. Hoover was already examining other files, other lives to manipulate and destroy. The photographs, what happens to them? Hoover didn't look up. "They wait. Insurance policies always wait, Mr. DeMarco, sometimes for decades. But they never expire, and they never forgive. His smile was winter cold. Sleep well in Connecticut. Dream of the life you might have had. The service elevator descended through the bowels of the federal building like a coffin sinking into earth. Two stone-faced agents flanked Vincent, their hands resting on their weapons. Neither spoke. The only sound was the mechanical whir of the elevator cables and the whisper of Vincent's own breathing. When the doors opened onto a basement loading dock, Vincent saw a black sedan waiting in the shadows. The engine was running, exhaust visible in the November cold. Beyond the dock, Washington, D.C. sprawled in the darkness, a city built on secrets, powered by lies, where presidents died and truth was just another commodity to be bought and sold. One of the agents handed him a train ticket to Hartford. The other pressed car keys into his palm, keys to the sedan, keys to his new life, keys to a prison with invisible bars that stretched from Connecticut to hell and back. Train leaves Union Station at 6 a.m., the first agent said. Car will be parked at Hartford Station. Garage deed and bank papers are in the glove compartment. Vincent climbed into the sedan's back seat. The leather was cold against his skin, and it smelled like cigarettes and fear. As the car pulled away from the federal building, he pressed his hand against the envelope hidden in his jacket. The wax seal felt rough under his fingers, like scar tissue that would never fully heal. Through the rear window, he watched J. Edgar Hoover's office light burning bright against the darkness. The last thing Vincent Torino ever saw before Frank DeMarco was born. Is due. The black sedan moved through Washington's empty streets like a hearse carrying secrets to their grave. Frank now, he had to start thinking like Frank DeMarco. Watched the city blur past the tinted windows. Every shadow looked like a federal agent, every streetlight like an interrogation lamp, waiting to expose the truth burning against his chest. The driver never spoke, never adjusted the radio, never even glanced in the rearview mirror, just another cog in Hoover's machine, programmed to deliver damaged goods to their final destination. Frank pressed his hand against the envelope one more time, feeling the ridge of the wax seal through his jacket. 30 years, that's how long insurance policies lasted in his world. 30 years of looking over his shoulder, waiting for the devil to collect. He was wrong by 27 years. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in 1993, cutting through the pre-dawn quiet of Frank DeMarco's modest house like a scream. He'd been awake for an hour already, old habits from the life before, sitting at his kitchen table with black coffee and yesterday's Hartford Courant. The headline about Clinton's first month in office might as well have been written in Chinese for all the attention he'd been paying it. Maria was still sleeping upstairs, probably dreaming about her finals at Sacred Heart University. 29 years old, studying to be a social worker, and she had no idea her adoptive father had once delivered a president's death warrant to the most powerful man in America. Frank had found her in a Hartford orphanage in 1965, a dark-haired baby with Maria Torino's eyes, the last gift from his murdered wife, born 3 months after Vincent Torino officially died. The phone rang again. Frank's coffee mug trembled in his hands, sending ripples across the black surface. In 30 years, only 2 people had this number, Maria and Doc Patterson at the clinic where she volunteered. Emergency calls came at midnight or noon, not dawn. He lifted the receiver on the 4th ring, his voice hoarse with dread. DeMarco. Vincent. The voice was aged whiskey poured over broken glass, familiar as his own reflection and twice as damning. It's time. Frank's blood turned to ice water. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor in an explosion of ceramic and caffeine. Through the kitchen window, he could see a black sedan parked across the street. Different model than the one from 1963, but the same predatory stillness, the same promise of violence wrapped in government chrome. Hoover's been dead for 20 years, Frank whispered. Death is just another career change in our business. The voice carried the weight of decades, the accumulated gravity of buried secrets and shallow graves. The insurance policy is still active, Vincent, and the premium just came due. Frank's chest constricted. The envelope, Christ, he could still feel that goddamn envelope like phantom pain from an amputated limb. I kept my mouth shut. 30 years of silence. And 30 years of compound interest. There was something else in the voice now, something that made Frank's skin crawl. Satisfaction. Did you really think Hoover would take those photographs to his grave? Did you think the most paranoid man in America wouldn't have contingencies for his contingencies? Through the window, Frank watched a figure emerge from the sedan. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Frank's garage netted in a month. The man carried a leather briefcase in his right hand, old-fashioned brown leather worn smooth by decades of handling. Even from 50 yards away, Frank recognized it. The same briefcase he'd carried into Hoover's office 30 years ago. The same briefcase that had held those terrible photographs, those images that had rewritten history with bullets and lies. "Who are you?" Frank's voice cracked like a teenager asking his first girl to dance. "I'm Hoover's retirement plan, his successor, his chosen heir to the kingdom of American secrets." The man was walking up Frank's driveway now, his footsteps audible through the phone's background noise. "And you, Vincent, are my inheritance." Frank stumbled backward from the window, his legs suddenly unsteady. 30 years of hiding, 30 years of building a quiet life with Maria, 30 years of pretending Frank DeMarco was real, and Vincent Torino was just a bad dream, all of it crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. What do you want? The same thing Hoover wanted, the same thing those photographs have always guaranteed. The doorbell rang, 3 measured chimes that sounded like a funeral dirge. Obedience. Frank looked up at the ceiling, where Maria was probably stirring in her sleep, innocent and unaware that her world was about to collapse. The coffee was spreading across the floor like spilled blood, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of thunder, even though the sky had been clear minutes ago. "Answer the door, Vincent. We have so much to discuss." The line went dead, leaving Frank alone with the echo of his real name and the weight of sins that refused to stay buried. Outside, the devil's newest disciple waited patiently, briefcase in hand, ready to collect 30 years of compound interest on Vincent Torino's soul. Frank stared at the dead phone in his hand, the dial tone drilling into his skull like a dentist's bit. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. He'd paid his dues, kept his silence, lived small and quiet for 3 decades. The debt was supposed to die with Hoover in 72. The doorbell chimed again, patient as cancer. "Dad?" Maria's voice drifted down from upstairs, thick with sleep. "You okay down there? I heard something break." Frank's throat constricted. "Just dropped a mug, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." His voice sounded almost normal, which terrified him more than the man waiting outside. After 30 years of lies, deception had become muscle memory. He set the phone down with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter what remained of his world. The coffee was still spreading across the floor, dark tentacles reaching toward the living room where family photos lined the mantelpiece, Maria's high school graduation, their fishing trip to Lake George, last Christmas morning when she'd surprised him with a new toolbox, and he'd actually believed the past was buried deep enough to stay dead. The doorbell rang a 3rd time, 3 chimes, like the Holy Trinity in reverse. Frank wiped his palms on his work shirt and walked to the door, each step feeling like a funeral march. Through the peephole, he could see the man clearly now, mid-60s, surgically straight posture, eyes like winter lakes. The briefcase sat at his feet like a faithful dog waiting for a command to kill. The man smiled and mouthed a single word, "Vincent." Frank's hand trembled as he reached for the deadbolt. Maybe if he ignored this, it would go away. Maybe if he called the cops, but what would he tell them? That a well-dressed man with a briefcase was haunting his doorstep? That ghosts from the Kennedy administration were collecting old debts? His fingers froze on the lock. In the reflection of the door's glass panel, he caught sight of himself. 58 years old, gray-bearded, soft around the middle from Maria's cooking, and the comfortable weight of a life well lived. Frank DeMarco, small-town mechanic, respected member of the community, deacon at St. Mary's Catholic Church. But Vincent Torino was looking back at him from the glass, young and hungry and stupid enough to think he could deliver death to J. Edgar Hoover and walk away clean. "Dad?" Maria was coming down the stairs now, her footsteps light on the wooden steps. "Who's at the door this early?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Frank closed his eyes, trying to will the man outside to disappear, trying to pray away 30 years of accumulated sin. But when he opened them again, the silver-haired stranger was still there, still smiling, still holding the key to Frank's personal apocalypse. "Insurance salesman?" Frank called back, the lie sliding out smooth as motor oil. "Wrong address?" He turned away from the door, hoping distance would solve the problem. In the kitchen, he grabbed paper towels and knelt to clean up the spilled coffee, focusing on the mundane task like a meditation. Normal people cleaned up coffee spills. Normal people had normal problems, mortgage payments and leaky faucets and arguments with their daughters about why she was still single at 29. Normal people didn't have presidential assassinations following them around like loyal hounds. The coffee was mostly cleaned up when he heard Maria's sharp intake of breath from the living room. "Dad? That insurance salesman is looking through our window." Frank's blood turned to slush. He crept to the edge of the kitchen doorway and peered into the living room. Maria stood frozen by the front window, wearing her Sacred Heart sweatshirt and flannel pajama pants, staring out at the man who was indeed pressed against the glass like a museum exhibit, examining the specimens inside. The stranger saw Frank watching and held up the briefcase, tapping it twice against the window. The sound was soft but somehow deafening. Leather against glass, past against present, Vincent against Frank. "He's been standing there for 5 minutes," Maria whispered, "just staring." "Should I call the police?" Frank wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell her to call the cops, the FBI, the National Guard, anyone with badges and guns who might stand between his family and the weight of history. But he knew better. Men like the one outside didn't worry about police. They carried badges of their own, signed by people whose names never appeared in newspapers. "No," he said, moving to Maria's side. Up close, the stranger looked even more familiar. Not his face, but something in his bearing, the way he held himself. Like Hoover's men from the old days. Like a federal agent who'd learned to dress better but never lost the predatory stillness. The man stepped back from the window and pointed toward the front door, his meaning crystal clear. "I'll handle this," Frank said. "Dad, this is crazy. Normal insurance salesmen don't—" "I said I'll handle it." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. Maria flinched like he'd struck her, and Frank immediately hated himself for letting Vincent Torino's edge show through Frank DeMarco's carefully constructed facade. Outside, the devil's accountant waited patiently for his 30 years of interest. Frank's harsh tone hung in the air like cigarette smoke, poisoning the morning quiet they'd shared for so many years. Maria's face crumpled, not with hurt but with something worse, recognition. She'd seen this version of her father before, in fleeting moments when he thought she wasn't watching, when news reports mentioned organized crime, when strangers lingered too long outside the garage, when the past clawed its way up through the carefully laid concrete of Frank DeMarco's life. "You're scaring me," she whispered, and Frank realized she wasn't talking about the man outside. The stranger tapped the briefcase against the window again. 3 deliberate strikes, past, present, future, all of it coming due at once. Frank could feel the weight of the envelope pressing against his chest, even though he'd buried it years ago in a safety deposit box in Hartford. Some burdens became part of your bones, carried in your marrow long after you'd set them down. "Go upstairs," Frank said, his voice gentler now but no less final. "Pack a bag. Tell them at the university you're sick. Tell them you need a few days." "What?" Maria's eyes went wide. "Dad, what's going on? Who is that man?" Frank looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Maria Torino's eyes staring back at him. His wife's eyes, the ones that had closed forever in that Hartford hospital bed while he held her hand and promised to keep their daughter safe. 28 years of that promise. 28 years of believing he could outrun the past through sheer force of will and good intentions. "Someone I owed money to," Frank said. "It wasn't entirely a lie. A long time ago. Before you." The man outside moved away from the window and began walking the perimeter of the house, his steps measured and methodical. Checking exits, calculating angles, looking for weaknesses in Frank's fortress of normalcy. The briefcase swung at his side like a pendulum counting down to judgment. "How much money?" Maria asked, and Frank almost laughed. If only it were that simple. If only he could write a check and make 3 decades of compound interest disappear. "More than we have." Frank moved to the kitchen window and watched the stranger examine the back door, testing the handle with casual confidence. Much more. "Then we'll figure it out together," Maria said, moving to stand beside him. "We always do. Remember when the garage almost went under in '89? Remember when I needed that surgery when I was 16? We figured it out." Frank's chest tightened. She had no idea what she was offering to fight, had no concept of the forces that had shaped her quiet life in Beacon Falls, the careful choreography of lies and misdirection that had kept her safe and ignorant for 28 years. She thought her biggest problems were student loans and whether to move to Boston after graduation. She didn't know her father had once carried photographs that could have toppled the government. She didn't know those photographs were still out there, still dangerous, still owned by people who collected debts in blood. "This isn't the garage, sweetheart." Frank's voice caught on the endearment. "This isn't something we can fix with hard work and good credit." The stranger completed his circuit of the house and returned to the front door, but he didn't ring the bell again. Instead, he sat down on Frank's porch steps, briefcase across his knees, and settled in to wait. The message was clear. He had all the time in the world, and Frank had none. "I need to know what happened to me," Frank said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Before you, before this house, before Frank DeMarco." Maria turned to study his face, and Frank saw the exact moment when the daughter who'd always trusted him completely began to wonder who he really was. The shift was subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a slight step backward, but it might as well have been a gunshot for the damage it did to his heart. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Frank wanted to tell her everything, wanted to explain about Vincent Torino and J. Edgar Hoover and the photographs that had cost a president his life, wanted to describe the weight of carrying presidential blood on your hands for 30 years, the way guilt accumulated interest like money in a bank account you could never access. But looking at her face, his wife's face, innocent and trusting and still believing the world made sense, he couldn't do it. "Pack your bag," he repeated instead. "Please, trust me one more time." Outside, the devil's accountant checked his watch and smiled, briefcase full of sins that would never expire, waiting to collect on debts that had been aging like wine in the darkness of American history. The reckoning had finally come to Beacon Falls. Maria didn't move. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, she stood in Frank's kitchen studying his face with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Frank's blood turn to concrete. "I already packed." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "Last night. After you came home from the garage acting like someone was following you. After you checked the locks 3 times and kept looking out the windows." Maria's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal. Worn, familiar, devastating. "After I found this hidden behind your bedroom dresser." Frank's vision tunneled. The journal was Maria Torino's, his wife's private thoughts from before Vincent's world exploded into blood and government secrets. He thought it was lost in the fire that had consumed their old life, but somehow it had survived, following him like a shadow for 3 decades. "You had no right." "To what? To want to know who my father really is?" Maria opened the journal, her fingers finding a specific page with practiced ease. "Listen to this, Dad. Vincent came home tonight covered in blood that wasn't his. He won't tell me what happened, but I can see it in his eyes. Something broke inside him today. He keeps talking about photographs and insurance policies and a man named Hoover. I'm scared, but not of Vincent. I'm scared of what they're making him become." Each word was a knife between Frank's ribs. He reached for the journal, but Maria stepped backward, clutching it like a shield. "She wrote this 3 days before she died, Dad. 3 days before the fire that supposedly killed Vincent Torino." Maria's voice cracked. "Except she wasn't talking about some stranger, was she? She was talking about you." Frank's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. "Maria, you don't understand." "I understand plenty." She flipped through more pages. 30 years of detective work hidden in his dead wife's handwriting. "I understand that Vincent Torino was declared dead in 1963, the same year Frank DeMarco appeared in Beacon Falls. I understand that you adopted me under false pretenses. using fake documents and a fake identity. I understand that everything I've believed about my life has been a lie. The man outside tapped the briefcase against the door. Once, twice, 3 times. Patient as a mortician, inevitable as cancer. How long have you known? Frank's voice came out as a whisper. 5 years. Since I turned 24 and started wondering why I had no grandparents, no extended family, no history before you found me in that Hartford orphanage. Maria's eyes were dry but fierce. Do you know what I found when I started digging? Vincent Torino had a wife named Maria. Maria Torino died in a house fire in 1963, 3 months pregnant. The baby's body was never found. Frank's legs gave out. He slumped against the kitchen counter, the weight of 30 years of secrets finally crushing his spine. You're supposed to be studying social work. I'm studying social work, with a minor in criminal justice and a very unhealthy obsession with organized crime archives. Maria closed the journal and fixed him with a stare that could have cut glass. I know about the Torino family's connection to the Marcello organization. I know about the botched hit on J. Edgar Hoover. I know about the 9 men who died that night. The kitchen felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing inward like the trash compactor in Star Wars. Frank could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could taste copper and regret, and the bitter ash of a life built on quicksand. What I don't know, Maria continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than screaming, is whether my father was a hero or a monster, whether he saved President Kennedy or killed him, whether the man who raised me is Vincent Torino the survivor or Vincent Torino the assassin. Outside, the devil's accountant stood up and brushed off his suit. Through the window, Frank could see him checking his watch with the casual confidence of a man who knew exactly how this story ended. You want to know the truth? Frank's voice was raw as exposed nerve. I don't know either. I've spent 30 years trying to figure out whether I was Hoover's victim or his accomplice, whether those photographs I delivered made me a patriot or a traitor, whether keeping you safe was penance or just another lie I told myself to sleep at night. Maria stared at him for a long moment, then walked to the front window and looked out at the silver-haired stranger who held their future in a briefcase full of sins. Well, she said, her voice carrying an edge Frank had never heard before, his wife's steel wrapped in her own generation's fury. I guess we're about to find out together. The man outside smiled and raised the briefcase in a small salute, as if he'd been listening to every word. The man's salute felt like a curtain falling on the final act of a 30-year performance. Frank watched his daughter's reflection in the window, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had gotten him into this mess in 1963, when he'd been young enough to believe bullets could solve problems and old enough to know better. Maria, her real name, felt foreign on his tongue after 3 decades of calling her by the diminutive. Before we open that door, before we let him in here with his briefcase full of devils, I need you to understand something. She turned from the window, and Frank saw his wife's ghost looking back at him, the same fierce intelligence, the same refusal to back down from hard truths. It was like seeing Maria Torino at 29, if she'd lived long enough to watch their world burn. The photographs, Frank continued, his voice barely above a whisper, the ones your mother wrote about. They weren't just insurance, they were— He searched for words that could contain the enormity of what he'd carried for 3 decades. They were proof that the assassination wasn't what people think, that Kennedy wasn't killed by some lone gunman with daddy issues. Outside, the silver-haired man checked his watch again and began walking toward the back of the house. Not threatening, not rushing, just a patient professional who understood that time was his most reliable weapon. The job was supposed to be simple, Frank said, moving to check the back door's deadbolt. 10 of us, Hoover's private office, a few photographs. In and out, nobody gets hurt except maybe some reputations. He laughed, the sound bitter as burnt coffee. We were supposed to be patriots, taking down a corrupt cop who'd gotten too big for his badge. Maria followed him through the house, and Frank could feel her studying his movements, the way he automatically checked sightlines, tested locks, calculated distances to exits. 30 years of playing small-town mechanic, and Vincent Torino was still there underneath, muscle memory older than his adopted daughter. But Hoover was waiting for us, Frank continued, like he knew we were coming. like someone had called ahead and given him our names, our roots, our mother's maiden names. They were back in the kitchen now, and Frank could see the man outside examining the basement windows with professional interest. 9 good men died that night, shot to pieces in a federal building while I stood there with an envelope full of pictures that could have ended the Cold War. What was in the photographs? Maria's voice was steady, but Frank could see her hands shaking. Frank closed his eyes, and 30 years dissolved like sugar in rain. He was 28 again, standing in J. Edgar Hoover's office, while the most powerful man in America smiled like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Proof that the Bay of Pigs wasn't a failure, it was a setup. Proof that Kennedy had been feeding information to the Soviets through back channels. Proof that our president was either a communist sympathizer or the most naive man ever to sit in the Oval Office. Frank opened his eyes and saw his daughter's face go white. But that wasn't the worst part. The man outside had completed another circuit of the house and was now standing directly behind the kitchen window, briefcase in hand, waiting with the infinite patience of a bill collector. The worst part, Frank whispered, was realizing that Hoover had orchestrated the whole thing. The photographs were real, but they'd been created by the FBI. Staged conversations, doctored documents, fake meetings, all designed to make Kennedy look like a traitor so Hoover could remove him legally, through impeachment and disgrace. Maria sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of 30-year-old secrets finally registering. But if Hoover had fake evidence, why kill Kennedy anyway? Frank nodded grimly. Because JFK figured it out. Because the president started asking questions about who had access to those photographs, how they were made, why his own FBI director was building a treason case against him. Frank moved to the window and stared at the silver-haired man, seeing Hoover's cold efficiency reflected in the stranger's patient smile. So they switched tactics. Dead martyrs don't answer questions. Dead presidents become saints, and saints don't get investigated. The man outside raised his briefcase and tapped it against the glass. 3 soft strikes that sounded like coffin nails being driven home. "And you helped them," Maria said, her voice hollow. "I delivered the photographs that gave them their timeline. I handed over evidence that proved Kennedy was onto their scheme, that he was planning to fire Hoover and clean house at the FBI." Frank's reflection in the window looked old and beaten, a ghost of the young man who'd thought he could dance with devils and walk away clean. Dallas happened 3 weeks later. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the sound of Frank's heart breaking in his chest. Outside, the devil's accountant checked his watch one final time, then walked to the front door. The doorbell chimed once, patient and inevitable as judgment. Maria stood up, her mother's steel wrapped in 30 years of hard-earned wisdom. "Well, Dad," she said, moving toward the hallway, "let's go find out what our sins are worth on today's market." The past had finally come home to collect its due. Frank caught Maria's arm before she reached the hallway. "Wait!" She turned, and for a moment they stood frozen in the threshold between their old life and whatever came next. The doorbell chimed again, more insistent now, and Frank could hear the sound of his heartbeat mixing with the tick of the wall clock, 2 timepieces marking the end of different eras. "If we open that door," Frank said, "there's no going back, no more Frank DeMarco, no more quiet life in Beacon Falls, no more pretending the past is buried." His voice cracked. "No more pretending I'm the father you deserved." Maria's eyes, his wife's eyes, blazed with something Frank had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but a fierce clarity that made his chest tighten with recognition. "You want to know something, Vincent?" She used his real name like a weapon, each syllable cutting through 30 years of carefully constructed lies. "I figured out who you really were 5 years ago. I've had 5 years to decide whether to turn you in, whether to disappear in the night, whether to hate you for stealing my childhood and replacing it with fairy tales." The doorbell chimed a 3rd time, followed by a patient knock. 5 measured strikes that sounded like a judge's gavel. "And," Frank whispered, "and I chose you. Every day for 5 years I woke up and chose to stay. Not because I believed the lies, but because I saw what you were trying to become." Maria stepped closer, and Frank could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You think I don't know what you sacrificed? You think I don't understand that Vincent Torino died so Frank DeMarco could raise someone else's daughter as his own? Frank's vision blurred. You're not someone else's daughter. You never were. I know. Her voice was steady now, anchored by a certainty that made Frank feel like he was drowning in redemption he'd never thought he deserved. But the man who's been my father for 28 years, he's not the same man who delivered those photographs. He's not the survivor who made a deal with J. Edgar Hoover. He's someone better, someone who chose love over survival, truth over safety. The knocking stopped. In the sudden silence, Frank could hear his pulse hammering against his eardrums, could taste the copper fear that had lived in his mouth for 3 decades. He's here for the other photographs, isn't he? Maria said. The real ones, the ones you kept as insurance. Frank nodded slowly. He'd never told her about the safety deposit box in Hartford, about the envelope that contained proof of Hoover's frame job, evidence that could posthumously clear Kennedy's name and expose the conspiracy that had shaped American history for 30 years. He's here because someone in that shadow organization finally realized I didn't just deliver the fake evidence, Frank said. I kept copies of everything, the real documents, the staging instructions, the communications between Hoover and Dallas, everything that proves Kennedy died because he was a patriot, not a traitor. Maria walked to the front door and stood with her hand on the deadbolt. Then we give them what they want. What? We give them the photographs. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. All of them. The real ones and the fake ones. Every piece of evidence that proves what really happened. She turned the lock with a decisive click. But not to them. To the Washington Post. To 60 Minutes. To every journalist and historian and conspiracy theorist who's been digging for the truth for 30 years. Frank stared at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened girl he'd been trying to protect, but the woman she'd become despite his protection. Fierce, brilliant, uncompromising, everything her mother had been, wrapped in her own generation's refusal to accept the world's lies. They'll kill us, Frank said simply. Probably. Maria's hand was steady on the doorknob. But they'll have to do it in the light this time. No more shadows, no more cover-ups, no more dirty secrets buried in safety deposit boxes while good people carry guilt that isn't theirs to carry. Frank moved to stand beside her, and for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Torino and Frank DeMarco felt like the same person. Not the survivor who'd made a deal with devils, not the small-town mechanic who'd hidden from his past, but a father who'd finally found something worth dying for. Your mother would be proud of you, Frank said. She'd be proud of both of us. Maria turned the doorknob, and 30 years of secrets stood ready to spill into the Connecticut morning light. Now let's go make sure President Kennedy finally gets the funeral he deserved. The door swung open, and the devil's accountant smiled like a man who just realized his carefully balanced books were about to catch fire. Mr. Torino, he said pleasantly, we have so much to discuss. The silver-haired man stepped into their hallway like he owned it, briefcase swinging at his side with practiced ease. Up close, Frank could see the family resemblance. The same cold efficiency that had made Hoover untouchable for 48 years, refined through another generation of institutional power. You must be Edgar Jr., Frank said, closing the door behind him. You have your father's eyes. Clyde Tolson Jr., actually. The man's smile never wavered, but close enough. The blood runs in similar channels. He glanced around the modest living room. 30 years of carefully curated normalcy, family photos on the mantel, Maria's college degree hanging crooked on the wall. Charming, very domestic. Maria stepped between them, and Frank felt a surge of paternal pride watching her refuse to be intimidated. You're here for something that doesn't belong to you. On the contrary, Miss Torino Tolson Jr. set his briefcase on the coffee table with ceremonial precision. Those photographs have been government property since the moment your father stole them. We're simply here to balance the books. The books have been balanced for 30 years, Frank said. I kept my end of the deal. I disappeared. I stayed quiet. I raised a good daughter and fixed honest engines and never looked backward. Yes, but circumstances evolve. Tolson Jr. opened the briefcase, revealing not weapons or threats, but documents. Thick manila folders stamped with official seals. Tell me, Mr. Torino, Have you been following current events? The collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening of classified archives, the inconvenient questions being raised about certain historical narratives? Frank felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. What questions? The kind that make people wonder whether Lee Harvey Oswald was quite as alone as we've maintained. The kind that might lead ambitious journalists to start connecting dots between Dallas and the Bay of Pigs. Tolson Jr. pulled out a newspaper clipping, Washington Post, dated 3 weeks ago. The headline made Frank's blood freeze. Newly released Soviet files cast doubt on JFK assassination lone gunman theory. The world is changing, Mr. Torino. Secrets that seemed buried forever are clawing their way to the surface, and certain parties are concerned that your insurance policy might provide unwelcome context to these emerging narratives. Maria snatched the newspaper clipping, scanning it with the hungry intensity of someone who'd spent 5 years chasing ghosts. This is why you're here now. You're not collecting old debts. You're trying to get ahead of new revelations. Very good. Tolson Jr. looked genuinely pleased. Your daughter inherited her mother's intelligence, I see. The casual mention of his wife hit Frank like a physical blow. Don't. Oh, but she was remarkable, wasn't she? Maria Torino. Brilliant, beautiful, pregnant with your child when that tragic fire claimed her life. The man's voice carried a tone of polite condolence that made Frank's skin crawl. Such a shame she never got to see her daughter grow up. The living room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock Frank had bought at an estate sale 15 years ago. Another man's time, another family's memories, just like everything else in his carefully constructed life. But here's the fascinating part, Tolson Jr. continued, pulling out another file. The Hartford orphanage where you found young Maria here? They have no record of her arrival, no paperwork, no intake forms, no medical records from 1965. He smiled like a man revealing the punchline to a decades-long joke. It's almost as if she simply materialized there, waiting for a grieving widower who needed a reason to stay hidden. Frank's vision tunneled. The pieces clicking together made a sound like coffin lids slamming shut. You arranged it, he whispered. The adoption, the identity, everything. Your father believed in long-term investments, Tolson Jr. said to Maria, whose face had gone white as bone china. Vincent Torino's disappearance needed to be complete, permanent, unquestionable. What better guarantee than giving him someone to protect, someone who would anchor him to his new life, make him grateful for the gift of anonymity? Maria's voice came out strangled. Who am I? You're exactly who you've always been, Maria Di Marco, or Torino, if you prefer. Daughter of a man who learned that love can grow in the darkest soil, that families can be built from shared secrets and mutual need. Tolson Jr. closed the file gently. The specifics of your origin are less important than what you became. Frank reached for his daughter's hand and found it steady despite everything. It doesn't matter, he said fiercely. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does. Love does. How touching. Tolson Jr. pulled out a final document. Thick, official, stamped with seals that carried the weight of absolute authority. Unfortunately, love doesn't change the fact that both of your lives have been built on foundations my organization controls. Your identities, your histories, your very existence in this quiet little town, all of it depends on our continued goodwill. He set the document on the coffee table like a dealer showing his winning hand. Now, he said pleasantly, about those photographs.